Can 3D anatomy apps transform Indian medical classrooms? Before I answer this question, I want to talk about the ground reality of anatomy education right now. The most common problem faced is a low donor to student ratio. And because cadaver availability is variable globally, the learning impact in anatomy is fairly inconsistent. And beyond the lack of donors for dissection, there's a more foundational issue. This has been constantly raised in two ways. Educators have been asking if there is a perceived decline in anatomical knowledge in modern medical graduates. And some have asked, why is anatomy so difficult to learn? These questions have been examined by medical professionals, and the consensus essentially leads to this understanding. That is, anatomy provides the structural basis for health and disease, which is the foundational denominator for modern medical practice. What I mean by that is anatomy, and by extension, the medical field, requires a physical basis to explain physiological, biochemical, and pharmacological events. For this to happen, students need to build a very familiar and intimate relationship with anatomy. And because of different factors, which we will explore in this video, the opportunity for students to do that and build this intimate relationship is further weakened. So in situations like this, I've found that 3D anatomy atlases, like Complete Anatomy, helps learn anatomy effectively and support the learning of a medical professional throughout their career. Hi, I'm Dr. Darren, a clinical anatomist, and I use Complete Anatomy, a 3D anatomy atlas for my day-to-day teaching in anatomy. In this video, we are going to examine the context of 3D anatomy apps in the Indian medical classroom. So let's jump right in and see what the current classroom situation looks like. Traditionally, the most common approach is to divide the learning opportunities into lecture and dissection lab teaching. Now, it's safe to assume that at any given point, if the amount of anatomical information starts at 100% on the left, by the time it reaches the student, it's probably somewhere around a range of 40 to 60%. Now, in a traditional lecture format, the educator mostly uses schematics, photographs, or figures of anatomical structures. Now, these obviously have their utility in teaching, but I believe the quality of spatial or visual information that they convey is a little lower and especially challenging for learners with low spatial abilities. So, doesn't this raise a red flag on how much anatomy our students actually know? Now, if we take a population size of 1,000 students for the sake of discussion, and if we assume that around 100 to 200 of these students have not understood these concepts effectively, wouldn't this raise a question on safe medical practice as these students advance in their medical careers? If we focus on student factors and see how they further decline the quality of learning, there are a few I'd like to talk about. And the most important one is spatial ability. Now, there's emerging evidence to link spatial ability with learning in anatomy, and there is decades worth of research to back this up. Now, spatial ability for the uninitiated is a cognitive trait that tells us how well a person can understand spatial information. For example, imagining how a cut section of a structure looks like. Now, most people assume that this understanding of spatial phenomena comes by default, but I don't think that's entirely true because of my own experiences as an art educator and what the evidence says. Now, when I was an art educator for a brief period, I noticed a wide range of perception among different kinds of learners in the same classroom. And that range of observing, examining, and making sense of space varied widely. Now, this is the same thing that I see in an anatomy classroom as well. Not every learner is able to pick up these spatial concepts in the same way. There are similarities between art classrooms and dissection halls. Consistent engagement with spatially challenging tasks is what links both of these together. So a small example. Now, a learner in an art studio worries about the volume of an object and how it relates to the structures around it when they try to sketch it. And these are the same kind of problems a student deals with in anatomy as well, especially when they're trying to examine the relationships of different abdominal structures. The next factor influencing students is something simpler, more obvious. Those are physiological factors. Now, it's safe to assume that every university student has a gross lack of sleep, and good nutrition is a struggle. And depending on how much social interactions or rest that these students are getting, all of these plays a role when the student shows up to their dissection labs or lectures, and this tells us whether they're actually ready to engage or not. Now, if we add memory into this, like how memory takes time and effort to form and how differently that works for different people, these factors together can push the amount of information absorbed even lower. And since traditional curriculums try to fit anatomy in 1 year, do learners have enough time and equal opportunity to be acquainted with anatomy? The last issue I'd like to talk about is that most modern curriculums are heavily synchronous, meaning they require the physical presence of the learner in a particular space. And it's obvious that dissection halls are resource intensive and they can't be made available 24/7. So once again, the opportunity for students to engage with spatial problems is minimized further. So given that I've painted a fairly grim picture, is there light at the end of the tunnel? I think there is. So let's take a look at these solutions. I have two solutions to bring up. The first is using 3D anatomy atlases. The one I personally like using is Complete Anatomy. It's a brilliant atlas because it has a strong academic review board. The models are very accurate, the app is regularly updated, and it has powerful educational features, especially pre-saved models where structures are built ready out of the box. Now, why do I think a 3D anatomy atlas is useful alongside the traditional classroom setting? First, the evidence. Now, there's mounting evidence to show that as learners engage with spatially challenging tasks, it improves their perceptual knowledge. For example, moving elements on screen, rotating models in the app interface provides adequate opportunities to build spatial reasoning for the learner. Second, in the traditional classroom setting, all of this learning experience is packed into a span of 1 year. Once that year is over, it's highly unlikely that students have access to dissection labs or any enrichment courses. Now imagine these students graduating and taking up specializations that involve invasive procedures or require clinical examinations. If their structural foundational basis is incomplete, I think we can make the connection between incomplete foundational knowledge and what we raised earlier, that is patient safety, misdiagnosis, or a decline in clinical skills. Which again reminds me of the art studio setting, where the range of observation varied so much between different learners with different spatial abilities. So I feel that with a 3D anatomy atlas, access to spatial material becomes available 24/7, enhancing and promoting asynchronous learning. It's almost as if the learner can carry a version of the dissection lab in their pocket. The second solution I think works effectively is drawing. Now, drawing is a powerful tool, and I think it's usually anatomists who encourage it. But because of a lack of theoretical basis for its use and confusion amongst learners, especially when some claim that they are not visual learners, drawing never gets used as a learning tool. Recently, a term called cognitive offloading has been used to explain the effects of drawing and provide a theoretical basis for it. So let's see what that's all about. A good example of cognitive offloading is what paper and pen is to a math problem. Now, some learners use a sheet of paper to work through their calculations instead of trying to do it all in their head. And that makes it much easier to solve a problem by externalizing it. A similar approach also applies to learning in anatomy, where drawing is used to offload the cognitive effort that is required to understand spatial relationships. Another example, much simpler, is what little children do when they want to count numbers. It's easy to count by displacing the effort onto one's hands, so 1, 2, 3. becomes so much easier to remember. Now, if you look at the schematic over here, it gives us an overview of an association between the learning experiences of medical graduates and time, and how this ends up being a very critical factor for learning anatomy. Now, this is where I'd like to say that a 3D anatomy atlas can help convert those opportunities into asynchronous learning opportunities. Students can learn on demand. And my favorite is that it provides spatial tasks. It allows students to manipulate models and also see how to reach places that would have been otherwise difficult to explore in conventional dissection curriculums. So, coming back to the question, can 3D anatomy apps transform Indian medical classrooms? My answer is yes. I believe they can. Tools like these can be useful throughout the career of a medical professional, helping make up for all the systemic and logistical challenges faced by training programs. In fact, I'd encourage educators in other specializations to think in the same way and make use of these applications when they take their clinical sessions. Because using a foundational structural basis consistently throughout the training of a medical student is what I think the need of the hour. Using 3D anatomy atlases thus are a powerful way to help students convert that 40 to 60% of knowledge and raise the bar to something like 80 to 90% so that we can have safer clinical practice and confident doctors. Thank you.